This video deals about the poem Australia. Objectives: to know about the significance of the poem Australia, to enable students to understand the sufferings of the Aboriginal people. Through the poem, the students will be able to know about the portrayal of Australia's uniqueness, location, and characteristics. Introduction. A.D. Hope, who had discussed Aborigin's geographical conditions about the people of Australia in his poetry, sometimes referred to as eco-poetry, poems that explore various aspects of the natural world can offer readers new outlook of native wildlife and sceneries, and the way we as humans interact with them. Nature has always been a common theme of Australian poetry. About the poet, Alberwent Hope, A.C. Obod, was an Australian poet and essayist known for his satirical slang. He was also a critic, teacher, and academic. He was stated into an American journal as the 20th century supreme 18th century poet. Hope was born in Coma, New South Wales. His father was Presbyterian minister and his mother as a teacher. He was educated partly at home and Tasmania, where they moved in 1911. 3 years later, they moved to Sydney. He attended Fort Street High School, the University of Sydney, and then the University of Oxford on a scholarship. Returning to Australia in 1931, he then trained as a teacher and spent some time drifting. He worked as a psychologist with the New South Wales Department of Labour and Industry, and as a lecturer in education and English at Sydney Teacher College. The poem Australia begins with a Hope's idea of Australia. He can be called a true Australian poet because in each and every poem talks about Australia directly or indirectly. His heart always long for his country, Australia. He has a desire to make his country a better place by stating the negative. In his poem Australia, the title itself is suggestive of hopes, concern, and love for his country. The first five stanzas deals with Australia's physical attributes as he elaborates that the landscape of Australia is mechanical and monotonous, comparing it to the contemplate uniform of the soldier of wars. In the very first stanza, this smile conveys the darkness of the expansion trees through their desolate grey color, which seem dull while they stand in a desolate, expansive land. In most nature poems, nature is a charming and alluring, attractive experience, but here nature seems to be very dull and gloomy. Portrayal of Australia's unique location and geography is one of the basic primary theme in Australian poetry. Hope has made us use of his theme at the very beginning of the poem. He has given a given description of the Australian landscape. He says in the opening lines, a nation of trees, trap green, a desolate green. The author compares his country to Sphinx. The poem gives a negative perspective of a country and especially the people and how this affects the life of survival in the Australian country. The poem reflects the absence of individualism and spiritual growth. According to the author, the continent reflects a ambiguous state. They did not care about the inner self or heart. The author compares this to the Sphinx. At this demolished, and he compares it to a stone lion which is sworn away, dissipated partly due to decay and neglect. The poet suggests how its country is decaying due to the neglect and negligence. The monotony is suggested by the word drab green, meaning nothing new is beginning developed in this country, and everything is only a copy of the English. The use of the words phoenix and the stone lion suggests antiqueness, which is confirmed that in the next line, where the poet confirms that Australia is not a young country, and those who call it young are lying. Since Australia was the last of the continent discovered by man, it was true to be called a young country, but at A.D. Hope, it's suggested that the country has, in fact, a very unique, antiquate Aboriginal history and past. He says it is the last of the land, meaning no other continent was discovered after Australia. Next, he employs a metaphor calling it a woman beyond the change of life whose breast is still tender but within the womb is dry, thus signifying a woman whose baby has been aborted, implying the Australia has great potential for growth and development, yet it has done nothing. In the second stanza, the poet laments the lack of cultural identity of his country. He says that his country lacks songs, architecture, and history, the emotions and superstitions of the younger lands. The poet laments the lack of spiritual and intellectual growth along with individualism in the Australians and says that his country's peoples are full of monotonous tribes from Cairns in the north of Perth in the south. The word monotonous in the U is used again to emphasize the sameness with the Western culture, thus lacking anything new and thus as drowning in immense stupidity. He opined that it is country filled with migrant people who came from many parts of the world. Most of them were dependent of people taking subsistence from their government. The author reveals that these people boast of surviving and cannot live up their lives to their full potential. They are merely skipping past the rigor of life and not drawing on their full ability. A country will excel and shine only when its inhabitants give their 100%, not when they merely survive or act like they inhabit a dying earth. Thus, according to the author, the people in this continent are not living but they are merely surviving. The third stanza describes a very clear image of five main cities of Australia. These five cities are compared of five teeming souls and are five big cities of the Melbourne, Sydney, Perth, Canberra, and Adelaide. According to the poet, the people in the cities are like parasites as they are dependent on the government of their subsistence. They have no individual entity of their own. They are robbing the state of its treasury and demanding its resources. He also tells us that the peoples are originally from Europe, but they have been come to Australia, so they could not survive well in their own countries, have become come to Australia as a second-hand citizen. The word polluted suggests that the immense number of such people, they also so many like teeming swarms of bees of insects breeding, germinating in these five cities of Australia. Such people offer nothing to a country and are contrary a burden on the country. The last two stanzas, the poet changes his tone, sounds of optimistic about this country, despite whatever the lack of mention by the poet in the earlier sections of the poem. The poet affirms that he is very glad to turn back home to his country, Australia. Modern though it's like a just lush jungle for him, and he wants to return to Arabian deserts of the human mind of his own country, where he hopes, just like a desert, some prophets or spiritual minds can evolve and grow. These prophets, he has says, originated in the Arabian deserts and he hopes that they will spring up in the wasteful mind of Australian people too. He hopes that his prophet will spring like some spirit which escapes the doubtful chit chatter of cultured apes, the word apes denoting the ability to cope up the apes, thus staging that the people of Australia only copy the Western civilization like the apes. The poet wants to remain in this country with this birthplace and all hopes that some prophet would come and revive greatness in his desert country, just like they did in the Arabian desert. The countrymen call themselves civilized by the country itself has no civilization of its own. The poem tells us about the Australian people, their lack of spirituality, the emptiness of feelings, and desolateness reflected in the emptiness of the land, meaning lack of cultural identity. Thus, the critics are just like cultural apes as they only copy the Western civilization and show no individuality given to the poem of nationalistic tone. Thus, in this sense, the Australia becomes a microcosm of the universe of this world. The poem Australia, the poem is reflection of not only of Australia but a comment on the modern living. The somber image of nation of trees, drab green and desolate grey, indicates that Australia is monotonous and dreary place. Literary device used in the poem are enjambment, imagery, alienation, metaphor with a mocking tone about the Australian culture, people and their lives. Satire is employed with a smiley to convey the culture, history and land of the Australia with a Sphinx, which was a figure from the Egyptian myth that possessed the body of the lion and head of the man, ram, or hawk. Another time, simile used in the poem is comparing Australia with the women, referring to as a infertility and empty with an inability to bear a fruitful condition of children, dynamic change. The poem reflects the changing mind of the poet from desolateness to hopefulness, from hoping his people to turn from grassroots to prophets, hoping the deserts of the land to turn into developed land. Australia is a country filled with the migrant people. Most of them are dependent on the government. Even though they are migrant, they have some strict government rules and regulations. The author wants to identify themselves as who really they are. Australia is a poem by A.D. Hope. His major subjects of English and philosophy. His collection of poems is Wandering the Island. He says that Australia is mechanical and monotonous land. In his poem, he says that his poetry is intentionally dramatized. The poem gives a kind of negative perception of Australian culture. The poem reflects the lack of individualism and spiritual poverty. It is it's the continent with the ambiguous state. The first stanza conveys that the trees is actually are dull and it stood in the desolate place. Generally, the term nature is charming thing, but in this continent, it looks like desolate one. Nobody cares about it. Many people give importance to their outer appearance. They do not care about inner beauty. Appearance can be deceptive. The author compares this to specifics. The people in Australia are heterogeneous in their tradition. The author calls them young, but it's ironically conveys their immatures. He points out the vulnerability of the land and the theme of the revelation. By reading this poem, the readers come to know that he is against his country. He says that there is no proper sense with respect of this culture. He adds that they are known creativity and independent. Pope is recognized as one of the most influential and celebrated Australian poet of 20th century. The subjects of his verses are varied in scope, stylistical through. His poetry can be regarded as conservative. He is considered a major writer of erotic verse. Pope is also viewed as the satirical poet, as many his works spoke fun at the technology, conformity, and absurdity of modern life. His other poems explore such topics as creativity, nature, music, and the wonders of science. Pope's incorporations of myth and legend is viewed as a defining characteristics of his poem. Pope discusses the role of the artist in contemporary society and his art asserts his theory of poetic expression. Pope's poetry rejects much of the modernist and postmodernist poetic forms, particularly the free verse poem that utilizes the traditional structure, the iambic quarantine, as well as classical mythology and legend. Analysis of the poem Australia. His poem theory, as reflected in his verse, seems to be neoclassical, outdated, and too conservative, more in line with the 18th century poetry than 20th century verse. Critics have also noticed the lack of any identifiable Australian material in his work and perceive him as an outsider within the tradition of Australia literature. His satirical verse has been recurring topic of critical attention and non-conformist and be biting viewpoint have attracted mixed reactions. The unacknowledged nature of Pope's poetic overture is by biting satire, the clarity of his language and the sophistication of his poetic vision is praiseworthy and he contributed much to the traditional prosody in contemporary poetry. Australia is next portrayed as a country that is nothing at all. There, the monotonous tribes from Canis to Perth, and the five main cities compared to the five themed resorts. The people who come to live in Australia boast not of living, but rather boast of merely surviving. The author is trying to put forward the point that here the people who move here are rather unwelcomed, and we are second-hand that give birth rapidly on this alien source and these newcomers are like giant leeches that take in all that is good in his country. Terminal question. What does the poet describe Australia's identity? What is the theme of the poem Australia? Describe the landscape of the Australia as given in the poem. Thank you.